Have you ever wondered what lurks behind the disciplined facade of military life? The Last Guard of the 87th, History of Cruel Hazing in the USSR, unveils a hidden world within the Soviet armed forces. This exploration sheds light on a disturbing practice that transformed the lives of many young soldiers. As we delve into this chilling narrative, brace yourself to confront the harrowing reality of military hazing, a shadow that lingered long after the fall of the Soviet Union. The dark reality of military hazing. The Soviet Union, a superpower that prided itself on military might and discipline, harbored a dark secret within its ranks. This secret was Dedovshchina, a term for the brutal hazing rituals that plagued its armed forces. This inhumane tradition, deeply ingrained in the military culture, began to gain notoriety in the early 1980s. Its roots can be traced back to the introduction of universal conscription, a law that brought together a diverse mix of recruits, village boys, orphans, students, and even those with criminal records. In theory, the army was a melting pot, transforming every recruit into a disciplined soldier. Yet in practice, it often morphed into a brutal playground where the strong preyed on the weak. Hazing in the Soviet military was not merely about establishing a pecking order or toughening up the new recruits. It was a systemic problem, often involving severe physical and psychological abuse. The tormentors, often soldiers who had served longer, justified their actions as a rite of passage, a necessary evil to forge men out of boys. However, this cruel practice often crossed the lines of human decency. New conscripts were subjected to relentless beatings, humiliation, and in some cases, forced labor. The abuse was not random, but a structured part of daily life within the barracks. Why did such cruelty persist? The answer lies in the hierarchical structure of the military and the culture of silence. Complaining or showing weakness was considered taboo. Officers, either complicit or turning a blind eye to the atrocities, allowed this vicious cycle to continue. Those who dared to speak up were labeled as informers and faced even worse treatment. The effects of hazing were profound and long-lasting. Many conscripts suffered physical injuries, while others were left with deep psychological scars. The trauma followed them long after their service, affecting their reintegration into civilian life. The Soviet military, a supposed bastion of unity and strength, was ironically a place where trust and camaraderie were often shattered by the very people meant to foster them. One might wonder, were there no checks and balances? Unfortunately, the military's insular nature meant that abuses often remained hidden from the public eye. The state-controlled media rarely reported on such issues, and the military's internal investigations, if any, were often cursory and biased. This lack of transparency and accountability created an environment where hazing could thrive unchecked. The cruelty of Dedovshchina was not just a problem for the individuals involved. It reflected a broader issue within Soviet society, the struggle between authority and individual rights, between the collective and the individual. The military, a microcosm of this society, mirrored these tensions in the most tragic of ways. But why focus on this grim chapter of history? It's important to understand that the legacy of military hazing in the USSR is more than a historical footnote. It's a cautionary tale of what happens when power goes unchecked and human dignity is sacrificed at the altar of discipline and conformity. It's a reminder of the need for empathy, respect, and the rule of law in all institutions, military or otherwise. The tragic tale of Arturas Sokolauskas. In the annals of Soviet military history, the story of Arturas Sokolauskas stands out as a poignant and tragic testament to the human cost of cruel hazing practices. Born in 1968 in Vilnius, Lithuanian SSR, Arturas was the son of Adolf, a turner, and Olga, a deputy head in a statistical office. Known among his peers for his calm demeanor and fearlessness, Arturas was a young man of principle and courage. After completing 8 grades, Arturas enrolled in a construction college, where he was remembered as a level-headed and quiet student. His character was marked by an unusual blend of calmness and bravery. He was not one to shy away from standing up against injustice. This trait would both define and doom his military service. In June 1986, Arturas, fresh out of college, was conscripted into the Soviet Army, assigned to a unit of the internal troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, MVD, stationed in Leningrad. These units were tasked with a variety of internal security duties, including the escort of prisoners across the vast expanse of the USSR. From the outset, Arturus encountered the harsh realities of military life in the form of Dedovshchina, the brutal hazing system entrenched in Soviet armed forces. He was thrust into an environment where senior soldiers, exploiting their position, subjected newcomers to relentless and often brutal initiation rituals. Arturus, like many others, found himself at the mercy of a system designed to break spirits and enforce obedience through fear and violence. The extent of the hazing Arturus endured was extreme. He and his fellow conscripts were subjected to physical assaults, psychological torment, and degrading tasks. Despite his resilience and courage, the constant abuse took its toll. A particularly harrowing incident saw him suffer a torn ear and a severe head injury, inflicted by a heavy bundle of keys wielded by a senior sergeant, Alexander Slazarev. In an attempt to escape the torment, Arturus applied for a transfer to a construction battalion, Strojbat, a unit typically assigned to less combative roles. However, his request was either ignored or inadequately addressed by the unit's leadership. The exact circumstances remain unclear, with some sources suggesting his transfer was approved but delayed, while others indicate it was never seriously considered. The situation escalated during a prisoner transport mission in early 1987. Arturus was part of a convoy escorting 50 prisoners from a prison known as Kresty in Leningrad to various detention facilities across Siberia and the Urals. The 2-week journey on special train, number 934, was a harrowing experience for Arturus, who faced not only the challenges of guarding dangerous criminals, but also continued mistreatment from his fellow soldiers. The abuse during this journey was relentless. Arturus was forced to endure sleep deprivation, was given intentionally spoiled or insufficient food, and was subjected to physical violence. His attempts to find respite or aid from his peers were met with mockery and further beatings. The relentless abuse reached a climax when Arturus was sexually assaulted by 2 of his fellow soldiers, an act that represented the ultimate violation of his dignity and humanity. The psychological impact of these experiences on Arturus was profound. He wrote letters home, concealing the extent of the abuse to avoid worrying his family and girlfriend. Internally, however, he was breaking. His fearlessness and willingness to stand up to bullies in the past were now crushed under the weight of relentless torment and humiliation. The tipping point came on the night of February 24, 1987, at the Leningrad station. The return of Special Train number 934 was meant to be the end of a routine mission. Instead, it became the scene of a tragic and violent outburst. Arturus, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, lashed out in a way no one could have anticipated. A night of horror. The Leningrad incident. On the night of February 24, 1987, the Leningrad train station bore witness to a gruesome event that would forever stain the history of the Soviet military. This was the night when Arturus Sokolauskas, a young soldier pushed beyond the brink, turned into an instrument of vengeance against his tormentors. The setting for this tragedy was Special Train No. 934, which had returned from a grueling 2-week journey escorting prisoners. Arturus was part of the escort team, a group that included soldiers like Senior Sergeant Slazarev, Junior Sergeant Nikiforov, Corporal Safarov, and others. The train also carried a civilian conductor, Mikhail Dashkiev. What transpired on that fateful night was a culmination of months of unrelenting abuse and degradation, suffered by Arturus at the hands of his fellow soldiers. As the train pulled into the Leningrad station, the carriage holding the soldiers was silent. Unbeknownst to those outside, a horrific scene lay within. Arturus, pushed to the edge by the constant abuse and a particularly brutal sexual assault, had snapped. Seizing an opportunity when most of his tormentors were asleep, he took Makarov pistols from the unlocked weapons cabinet and embarked on a chilling spree of retribution. In a cold, calculated manner, Arturus moved through the carriage. The first to fall was Senior Sergeant Slazarev, the man who had been a significant figure in the abuse Arturus endured. Next were Junior Sergeant Nikiforov and Corporal Safarov, along with several others who had participated in the hazing. Arturus's actions were methodical, leaving little chance for resistance or escape for his sleeping victims. The brutality of the act was shocking. The soldiers, some of whom had been asleep on their bunks, were shot at close range. Blood-soaked mattresses and the confined space of the train carriage bore silent testimony to the violence of Arturus's outburst. The body of Nochka Pelipenko, another victim, was found at the entrance to the kitchen, separate from the others. As the news of the incident broke, it sent shockwaves through the military and civilian populations alike. The military prosecutor of the Leningrad garrison and the head of the investigation department arrived at the scene, confronted with a bloodbath that defied easy explanation. The initial theory was that Arturus, driven to mental breakdown by the hazing, had lashed out in a blind rage. What followed was a harrowing investigation, as authorities tried to piece together the events leading up to the tragedy. Witnesses recounted the relentless abuse that Arturus had suffered, painting a picture of a young man driven to the edge by the inhuman treatment he endured. The incident forced the Soviet military and the public to confront the dark reality of Dedovshchina, the cruel hazing practices that had become an integral part of military life. It raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of discipline, authority, and the value of human life within the military structure. The Leningrad incident was more than just a tragic outburst of violence. It was a symptom of a deeply flawed system. It highlighted the need for fundamental changes in how the military operated, in its treatment of young recruits, and in the oversight and accountability of those in command. Aftermath and investigation. The aftermath of the Leningrad incident was a period of intense scrutiny, soul-searching, and repercussions, both within the Soviet military establishment and the society at large. The brutal awakening to the horrors of Dedovshchina, or military hazing, brought forth by Arturas Sokolauskas' rampage, left a scar that would not easily heal. In the immediate aftermath, the Soviet authorities were faced with a dual challenge: managing the public relations fallout and conducting a thorough investigation into the incident. The military prosecutor's office of the Leningrad garrison spearheaded the inquiry, with the daunting task of unraveling the events that led to this tragic night. The investigation revealed a complex web of factors contributing to the incident. Central to this was the culture of Dedovshchina within the Soviet military. Testimonies from fellow soldiers and evidence gathered painted a grim picture of the systematic abuse that Arturas, along with other conscripts, had endured. The inquiry brought to light the harsh realities of military life for many young Soviet soldiers, marked by brutal hazing rituals, physical and psychological abuse, and a code of silence that discouraged victims from speaking out. The role of the commanding officers came under scrutiny. The investigation found that many in positions of authority either actively participated in the hazing or turned a blind eye to it. This negligence and complicity by the command structure were key in allowing the culture of abuse to thrive unchecked. The failure of the military's internal mechanisms to address the grievances of conscripts like Arturas was a glaring issue that demanded attention. As the details of the incident and the systemic issues within the military became public, there was a palpable sense of shock and anger. The Soviet public, largely unaware of the extent of Dedovshchina, grappled with the brutal reality of what was happening within the ranks of their armed forces. This led to heated discussions in the media, among the populace, and within the corridors of power about the need for reform in the Soviet military. The government faced mounting pressure to take decisive action. In response, there were calls for and attempts at reforming military practices, focusing on improving the treatment of conscripts and strengthening the oversight of military commanders. These reforms aimed at creating a more humane and professional military environment, one where the dignity and rights of individual soldiers were respected. However, the road to reform was fraught with challenges. Changing a deeply ingrained culture like Dedovshchina required more than just policy changes. It necessitated a shift in mindset and values, both. Within the military and the broader society, the entrenched traditions and attitudes of the military establishment proved resistant to rapid change, and progress was slow and uneven. The families of the victims, both the slain soldiers and Arturas, were left to grapple with the personal tragedies that had befallen them. For the families of the soldiers killed by Arturas, there was a struggle to reconcile the memory of their loved ones with their involvement in the hazing practices. For Arturas's family, there was the pain of seeing a loved one transformed from a victim to a perpetrator, and the agony of dealing with the legal and social consequences of his actions. Arturas Sokolauskas himself became a symbol of the tragic consequences of military hazing. His trial and subsequent life were followed closely, becoming a part of the broader narrative about the need for reform and justice in the military system. The trial, which garnered significant public and media attention, highlighted the complex interplay of victimhood and culpability in cases of severe psychological trauma and abuse. The echoes of tragedy, impact on families and society. The reverberations of the Leningrad incident transcended the confines of the military and deeply impacted the families involved and the wider Soviet society. This tragedy, resulting from Arturas Sokolauskas's retaliation against the brutal hazing he suffered, left an indelible mark, highlighting the human cost of systemic abuse and neglect. The families of the soldiers who lost their lives faced a complex web of emotions. The grief of losing a son, a brother, was compounded by the harrowing details of their deaths and their involvement in the hazing practices. They had to grapple with the duality of their loved ones being both victims and perpetrators in this tragedy. The public nature of the incident meant that their private grief was thrust into the spotlight, often accompanied by judgment and scrutiny from the public and media. For Arturas's family, the impact was devastating. They had to come to terms with the transformation of Arturas from a victim of severe abuse to a perpetrator of a violent crime. The burden of societal stigma, legal battles, and the relentless media attention added to their anguish. Arturas's actions, while a direct consequence of the abuse he endured, placed his family in a challenging position, navigating the fine line between empathy for his suffering and the horror of his actions. The Leningrad incident catalyzed a national conversation about Dedovshchina and the conditions within the Soviet military. For many in Soviet society, this was a jarring exposure to the harsh realities of military life that had been largely hidden from public view. It raised critical questions about the nature of military service, the role of the state in protecting its soldiers, and the broader societal attitudes towards violence and authority. The incident became a symbol of the systemic failures within the Soviet military and the government's inability to safeguard the well-being of its young conscripts. It challenged the public perception of the military as a revered and unassailable institution, revealing the vulnerabilities and flaws within its ranks. The media coverage of the Leningrad incident was extensive and often sensationalized, reflecting the shock and fascination of the public with the gruesome details. This coverage played a significant role in shaping public discourse, bringing to light the issue of military hazing and its consequences. It also led to a greater scrutiny of military practices and the treatment of conscripts. In many ways, the incident and its aftermath became a rallying point for discussions on human rights and the need for reform in the Soviet Union. It highlighted the disconnect between the state's ideology and the reality of life within one of its most fundamental institutions. This contributed to a broader sense of disillusionment and skepticism towards the state, particularly among the younger generation. The long-term impact of the Leningrad incident was felt in the gradual changes and reforms that were called for in the Soviet military. While the pace of change was slow, the tragedy underscored the urgent need for reforms to address the issue of hazing and to improve the treatment and conditions of military conscripts. Reflections and consequences. The Leningrad incident, a tragic consequence of the systemic military hazing known as Dedovshchina in the USSR, stands as a stark reminder of the corrosive effects of unchecked brutality and the importance of human dignity within any institution. The reflections on and consequences of this event extend far beyond the immediate aftermath, influencing societal attitudes, military reforms, and the broader narrative of human rights within the Soviet Union. The incident forced a re-evaluation of the entrenched military culture that allowed such hazing practices to flourish. It brought to light the harsh reality that Dedovshchina was not merely about establishing a hierarchy or a rite of passage, but often involved severe, inhumane abuse that could have devastating psychological and physical effects on young conscripts. This revelation challenged the traditional Soviet view of the military as a revered institution and a bastion of discipline and strength. In response to the public outcry and the undeniable evidence of systemic issues within the armed forces, there was a noticeable push for military reforms. These reforms aimed to address the rampant abuse and improve the overall conditions for conscripts. The focus was on creating a more humane environment, where the dignity and rights of individual soldiers were respected. Measures included better oversight of military commanders, stricter enforcement of laws against physical and psychological abuse, and attempts to foster a more supportive and respectful atmosphere within the barracks. However, these reforms faced significant challenges. Changing a deeply ingrained culture like Dedovshchina required more than policy shifts. It necessitated a fundamental change in mindset and values, not only within the military but also in society at large. Progress was slow and often met with resistance, highlighting the complexity of reforming long-standing institutional practices. The Leningrad incident had a profound impact on Soviet society, contributing to the broader discourse on human rights and state responsibility. It sparked a national conversation about the nature of authority, the role of the state in protecting its citizens, and the importance of individual rights. The tragedy highlighted the disconnect between the state's ideological claims of protecting and empowering its citizens and the reality of abuses occurring within one of its key institutions. This incident also played a role in the growing sense of disillusionment and skepticism towards the Soviet government among the public. It added to the narrative of a state that was increasingly seen as failing to uphold its promises and protect its people, contributing to the broader atmosphere of change and reform that characterized the late Soviet era. The legacy of the Leningrad incident is multifaceted. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of a culture that prioritizes conformity and toughness over the well-being of individuals. It reminds us of the importance of empathy, respect, and psychological support in high-pressure environments like the military. The broader context of hazing in the USSR military. While the Leningrad incident, involving Arturas Sokolauskas, is a stark and tragic example of the consequences of military hazing, it's essential to understand it within the broader context of Dedovshchina in the Soviet armed forces. This chapter explores the historical, cultural, and institutional factors that cultivated an environment where such a tragic event could occur. The phenomenon of Dedovshchina, though peaking in the 1980s, had its roots in the post-World War II era. The rapid expansion and subsequent fluctuations in the Soviet military created an environment ripe for the emergence of informal, often brutal hierarchies among conscripts. Over the years, as the memory of the war faded and the Soviet Union faced various internal and external challenges, these practices evolved into a systemic problem. The influx of diverse groups of conscripts, including those from various socioeconomic backgrounds and republics of the USSR, further complicated the dynamics within the military units. The culture of masculinity and toughness prevalent in Soviet society played a significant role in fostering and perpetuating Dedovshchina. The military was seen as a crucible for turning boys into men, and the harsh conditions and treatment were often rationalized as necessary for building strength and character. This perspective was reinforced by state propaganda, which glorified military service and valor, while downplaying or ignoring the darker aspects of military life. The Soviet military's hierarchical structure and closed-off nature provided fertile ground for abusive practices to thrive unchecked. Senior conscripts nearing the end of their mandatory service wielded significant power over newer recruits, often with little oversight from commanding officers. In many cases, officers either turned a blind eye to the abuse or were complicit in it. The lack of effective channels for reporting abuse, combined with a culture that stigmatized victims for speaking out, meant that most instances of Dedovshchina went unreported and unpunished. The impact of Dedovshchina on the conscripts was profound and multifaceted. Beyond the immediate physical harm, the constant threat of violence and humiliation led to significant psychological trauma. Many conscripts suffered from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, both during and after their service. The psychological toll of this abuse often extended into their post-military lives, affecting their reintegration into civilian life and their long-term mental health. The Leningrad incident, while tragic, served as a catalyst for bringing the issue of Dedovshchina into the public eye. For the first time, the Soviet public and policymakers could no longer ignore the systemic abuse occurring within the military. This increased awareness and the resulting public outcry played a crucial role in initiating discussions about military reform and the need to address the issue of hazing more effectively. Following the Leningrad incident, there were efforts within the Soviet military and government to address the issue of Dedovshchina. These efforts included increased scrutiny of military units, implementation of programs aimed at improving the treatment of conscripts, and attempts to create a more transparent and accountable military structure. However, these reforms faced significant resistance from within the military establishment, where many viewed Dedovshchina as an integral, albeit unofficial, part of military life. The deeply entrenched nature of these practices, coupled with the vastness and diversity of the Soviet armed forces, made meaningful change difficult and slow.